This week on the podcast, it's not often that someone is known to be the greatest of something. It's not often that someone's known to be the Michael Jordan of something, the Babe Ruth of something. And Jimmy Jacobs was known to be the greatest of all time. At a point in 1985, it was argued that Jimmy Jacobs was the greatest of all time at 4 different things. And they were 4 pretty dissimilar things.
Welcome back to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to preserving the history of boxing and its larger-than-life characters, and is brought to you by Clear Contender Media. Now, here's your host, Casey Kid History Callanan.
What's up, boxing fans? I was watching The Undisputed Truth just last night, a one-man show produced by Spike Lee about Mike Tyson's life. It is something he does, I think, on Broadway, where he stands there in the limelight and really just opens up his soul to the audience about his life, about his struggles, about his triumphs. It's a really important piece of art for people that are boxing fans to get a chance to check out. It is on HBO on demand, however you access the Great Home Box Office channel. You'll be able to check it out. I believe for a while, Mike traveled the United States and perhaps the world doing this one-man show and putting it on for fans, and he really just opens up his heart, and it's a beautiful piece of art. If you are a fan of the stage, if you're a fan of Broadway, although Mike doesn't do any singing, but if you're a fan of theater, this is it. Someone bearing their soul, opening up to the fans about their life. Make sure you check out The Undisputed Truth, one-man show that Mike Tyson has. It's produced by Spike Lee and on HBO as of right now. Now, the reason that I wanted to open up this podcast into a discussion related to Mike Tyson is because I did just watch that one-man show last night, but it got me thinking about a guy named Jimmy Jacobs. Jimmy Jacobs is a boxing promoter who is no longer with us. He actually passed away in the late 80s from leukemia, but there is something about Jimmy Jacobs that I knew when I started reading more about him, and this was long before last night, that we need to do an episode about him because he is the essence of what this podcast is all about. He's almost, I don't want to say in a disrespectful way, but he's almost a forgotten boxing character because he passed away such a long time ago in 1988, and because he was so young when he died, and a lot of fans don't know who Jimmy Jacobs was. And I knew that we had to do an episode about him, and last night watching the one-man play where Tyson, actually, I don't believe he mentions Jimmy Jacobs in this Undisputed Truth documentary, but he does mention a fight he had with Mitch Blood Green, which I'm sure if you're a boxing fan, you remember when Mike Tyson fought Mitch Blood Green in 1980, might have been 1985. So I started, after I watched this awesome one-man show with my fiance, which I started watching about a few years ago, and something popped up and I couldn't finish watching it. So I finally, all these years later, was like, I gotta finish watching this Undisputed Truth one-man play. So it came out in 2013, and in the middle of it, Tyson mentions the historic dispute he had with Mitch Green, who really just was always trying to get under the skin of Mike Tyson. And after watching this documentary with my fiance, she ended up going to bed, and I flipped on YouTube and I was like, I want to watch that fight with Mitch Green because it goes the distance, and Mitch Green is another incredible boxing character that we will profile on this program. But in the lead up to the fight on YouTube, there was a profile about Mike Tyson. This was just 14 months after he started professional boxing. And I love this fight was on HBO back in the 80s, and HBO always in the pre-fight build up would profile each boxer typically. That's something I look forward to watching when I do check out old YouTube videos of fights, because you do get to see the character of each individual laid out. And of course, in this lead up to the fight, they talk about Jimmy Jacobs and the other manager of Mike Tyson at that time, man by the name of Bill Caton, a longtime part of Mike Tyson's early managerial team. Caton was a entrepreneur for a long time businessman and an associate of Jimmy Jacobs. And this was the early management team, I believe, that Tyson had before his long-time partnership with, of course, Don King Promotions. It's not often that someone is known to be the greatest of something. It's not often that someone's known to be the Michael Jordan of something, the Babe Ruth of something, perhaps even the Jerry Rice of something. When I talk about the greatest of all time in American football, I always like to say there's really no NFL player, I think, that's objectively the greatest of all time. You could say Jim Brown. Recently, you could say Tom Brady. But I think objectively, the greatest wide receiver of all time is Jerry Rice. So anyways, there's no real greatest of all time person that's known for four different things. And Jimmy Jacobs was known to be the greatest of all time. At a point in 1985, it was argued that Jimmy Jacobs was the greatest of all time at four different things. And they were four pretty dissimilar things. One of them being athletic, two of them being in the collecting realm, and one of them being in business. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen those beer commercials where they talk about the world's most interesting man, and everyone's vying to be the world's most interesting man, it would seem. But of course, Jimmy Jacobs, I would nominate him for the world's most interesting man in 1986 because it was world famous boxing commentator and American sports writer Larry Merchant who said in May of 1986 that Jacobs is the greatest handball player who ever lived. He has the greatest collection of fight films in the world. 98% of all fight films ever made at the time, 26,000 of them were owned by Jimmy Jacobs. And he was the greatest collector of comic books in the world. That's three disparate things you would think. And then the fourth was he was vying to have the greatest fighter in the world. And in 1986, Jacobs definitely checked that fourth box. And he did, in fact, have the greatest fighter in the world under his tutelage, under his management agency. Jimmy Jacobs had four different things, two of them connected, of course, the fighting and the fight films. But then he was also the greatest handball player in the world and also had the greatest comic book collection in the world. Now that is, where do we begin to unpack all of that? Well, the most significant and most salient piece of those four things about Jimmy Jacobs that rings so true and rings most interesting to me as a fight fan would, of course, be the fact that he owned the largest collection of fights in the world. So this was very important in what Mike Tyson would ultimately become, and that is someone who studied closely all of the greatest fights in the world since the 1800s. I believe there were some footage in Jimmy Jacobs' collection that dated back to the late 1800s. And of course, Jimmy Jacobs was a friend of Cus D'Amato, who was Mike Tyson's trainer and father figure. Adopted father of Mike Tyson was Cus D'Amato, and he was friends with Jimmy Jacobs. And because of that friendship, Tyson had access to the world's greatest collection of fights. And he, you better believe, studied all of those fights in Cus's mansion in Catskill, New York in the 80s. And it became the perfect storm, part of the perfect storm that allowed Mike Tyson to become the youngest heavyweight champion in history when he won the belt in 85. So that's what is to me so interesting about Jimmy Jacobs from a fight perspective. The fact that he owned this great collection of fights that he would sell in 1998, or I'm sorry, Bill Caton would sell that library to ESPN for millions and millions of dollars in 1998. And they would use that in their TV network called ESPN Classic. How did Jimmy Jacobs amass this incredible collection of fights, you may ask? Well, it was because he was the world's best handball player for over 2 decades. Pretty much over 2 decades, Jimmy Jacobs was the world's greatest handball player. And what is handball? Maybe you're not familiar with it. Maybe you are familiar with it. It's a game I wasn't familiar with until I was maybe 10 years old, and my dad took me from our grandma's house in upstate in northern New Jersey to a New York Yankees game. And on the drive into the Bronx in New York City, we saw these guys playing a game against the wall. They were smacking a rubber, what looked like a racquetball against the wall. And I was just like, what? Well, I don't think I said anything. And my dad said, well, that's handball. You probably have never seen that. You probably don't know what that is. And that was the first time I ever saw someone playing handball. And then, of course, I would see it years later in the city of Chicago. They play it in Los Angeles. If you're ever in LA on Venice Boardwalk in Venice Beach, they play handball there right on the beach. It's really picturesque, probably one of the most beautiful places in America. They play, the city of Los Angeles has set up handball courts. Handball is a sport that has a Hall of Fame. I don't know if it's in the Olympics anymore, but it is a sport that has a governing body. It is a legitimate sport, and the Babe Ruth, and the greatest of all time that ever played that sport, was Jimmy Jacobs. And while he was traveling the world and traveling Europe playing handball, he ended up building his collection of fight films. And I think a lot of it started from the fact that Jacobs was this lifelong boxing enthusiast, and he would travel the world and would buy fights throughout Europe when he was, playing handball. This was before the internet, and he could physically be in these places that you needed to be all over the world because he was playing handball, and he bought these fights. And you're talking about a guy that was a huge boxing fan who had read about the fact that there was a controversial decision in a Joe Louis versus Jersey Joe Walcott fight in 1947. And it was something that was so controversial, and Jimmy Jacobs was such a big fan of fights that he decided he had to own that fight so he could see for himself, again, way before YouTube, way before the internet, who won that fight. So he tracked down a copy of that old fight film, and the rest was kind of history as he just amassed and built his collection over time. Of course, in 1912, there was a congressional ban on the interstate trafficking of boxing films, and that is why Jacobs had to go around the world to get a lot of these fights. So I'm not sure why that ban took place in 1912 in America. Jacobs friends with Cus D'Amato, and he was around the sport of boxing in a business sense. But Jacobs, unlike any other individual I've ever come across in boxing, owning this incredible fight collection, having that friendship with Cus D'Amato, and then, of course, becoming Mike Tyson's management pre-Don King. Jimmy Jacobs was one heck of an athlete, just excelling at every sport, most notably handball. There's speculation out there that Jacobs did some incredible athletic feats before being named the greatest handball player of all time, and was offered a chance to try out for the U.S. basketball team. He was apparently a great ski shooter and could golf, and had a handicap around 0, which is known as a scratch golfer. And apparently he could run 100 yards in under 10 seconds. He was also a United States veteran serving in the Korean War. But his best athletic feat was, of course, coming in the sport of handball, where he did not lose a handball match from 1955 through 1969, winning every national handball competition match he played in. That's how you earn a nickname as the Babe Ruth of your sport. I guess something about Jimmy Jacobs really appealed to me because I'm in no way comparing myself to Jimmy Jacobs, by the way. But I just am a guy that has a lot of different interests in a lot of things in life that just don't seem to be connected. I think there's so many cool things to be interested in life, and why limit yourself to just specializing in one thing? And Jimmy Jacobs certainly didn't specialize in one thing, being the greatest handball player of all time, having the greatest collection of fight films in the world, and having the greatest comic book collection ever. You can evaluate those things. It's not like this was something that people were speculating about Jimmy Jacobs being in the mid 80s when he was these three greatest things in the world. You can put a price value on a comic book collection. You can price a fight film collection, and you can quantify these things. And Jimmy Jacobs was objectively the three greatest things in the world at three different things. Sadly, he died in 1988. He is an inductee of the International Boxing Hall of Fame, the IBHOF. He's also a member of the World Boxing Hall of Fame, the International Jewish Sports Hall of Fame, and the U.S. Handball Hall of Fame. The International Jewish Sports Hall of Fame is in Israel, for those of you wondering. He was also named the Boxing Manager of the Year in 1986. His business partnership with Bill Cayton took place when they merged their fight collection. Cayton was a media and advertising executive, and together the two formed a corporation called The Big Fights, Inc., and they restored and preserved fight films. Cayton would use these fight films in, I can't even remember what decade it was. Might have been actually the 50s. And what he would do with these fight films was, as an advertising executive, he would play. Now remember, media was a lot different back then. He would play these fights, these old fights, simply as a way, and he would play them on TV on a certain station, and he would promote a product. He would promote one product during the showing of these films. Maybe it was like something weird like a shaving cream or a pomade or something, a random product that perhaps a man would be involved with as the target demographic of these fights. And that was kind of the way that old school advertising worked. It was a fight night presented by, XYZ shaving brand. So that's kind of how the business relationship between Cayton and Jacobs started. And this would all accumulate when they would sign their biggest client in 1984, and that was, of course, Iron Mike Tyson. Adding to the lore of Jimmy Jacobs, he and I believe his partner, Bill Cayton, there were together nominated for 3 Academy Awards. Legendary Champions, the Heavyweight Champions, and Jack Johnson were 3 titles of films that they owned the rights to, and they actually ended up getting nominated for an Academy Award because of those fights. So add Academy Award nominee to the insane resume of one Jimmy Jacobs, the world's most interesting man in 1985. I don't think it's ever been disclosed how much money ESPN bought the combined fight collection of Jimmy Jacobs and Bill Cayton, but it is speculated it was around $100 million. Now, I can't verify that, but that is what's been suggested. When Jacobs died of leukemia in 1988, he had been diagnosed with that for quite some time, but he kept it close to himself and did not reveal it to his friends. And a lot of people didn't even know that there was anything wrong until he passed away suddenly. This giant athlete, this incredible man, dying at just 58 years young because of leukemia. I think it's pretty apparent based on the facts that I'm aware of that Tyson had a great relationship with Jimmy Jacobs. The relationship he had with Bill Cayton might not have been so stellar because when Jacobs died in 1988, Tyson wanted to replace Cayton, who was the remaining living business partner of that Jacobs-Cayton management team. Tyson wanted to replace Cayton with Don King, and he sued Cayton a couple times looking to end that business partnership, and finally the matter was settled out of court. And now I don't know how well that ended up working out for Iron Mike Tyson, because he would wind up in plenty of lawsuits with Don King himself, and he was notoriously had a icy relationship with Don King for many decades. Of course, Mike Tyson seems to be making amends with Don King in recent years, as recently as the last year or two. There was footage maybe couple years ago of Mike Tyson throwing water on Don King at a recent event, and that is kind of out of character for modern Mike Tyson, because Mike Tyson seems to be have a lot of self-control right now, and Mike has commented on that water tossing incident recently, saying that he really feels bad about it, and he has tried to make amends with Don King because Mike doesn't like to have any enemies, as most of us don't. According to Jacobs' obituary, he had a collection of more than 800,000 comic books. This is his obituary that was in the New York Times. But the reason we all know about him as fight fans is because of that relationship he had with Cus D'Amato. When Cus moved to Catskill in the early 70s, Jacobs and his partner Caton financed the amateur boxing program that D'Amato had started there, and they weren't doing this out of charity. They were doing this and again, this is what I'm assuming. I don't have these facts in front of me, but it's not like they do this for charity. It's because they're business associates, they're businessmen, and they want to use this boxing program to try to find the next Mike Tyson, which is exactly what they ended up finding. Boxing is a business at the end of the day. I think it has some great benefits for young amateurs who want to get involved in boxing, and I think that because there was those business interests, that there was able to be a lot of people that joined Cus D'Amato's boxing program that were able to have a better life, that were able to get their life on track because of this Cus D'Amato amateur boxing program that was financed by a private enterprise looking to make monies. It ended up finding Mike Tyson. Everyone out of that deal ended up making millions and millions and millions of dollars. Of course, Cus D'Amato was no longer alive when Tyson won the heavyweight title, but definitely Caton and Jacobs got their investment back. By all accounts, Jimmy Jacobs seemed to be a pretty decent guy, and he did have leukemia for about 8 years before he really made it public, and everyone knew that he was no longer going to be with us. So I do think learning about Jim Jacobs on the Characters of Boxing podcast is something that was necessary, and I hope you all enjoyed learning about the world's most interesting man of 1985, because there are some really cool takeaways to learn about Jim Jacobs. But to me, the most incredible thing about Jim Jacobs was his athletic abilities and the fact that he was the greatest handballer that ever lived. Thanks for listening to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. Be well.
Thanks for listening to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Clear Contender Media. For more, visit us on clearcontender.com.